Today, most children spend thousands of hours sitting in classrooms, listening to teachers, reading textbooks, and completing assignments designed to prepare them for adult life. We often assume that formal education is the natural way children learn, because schools have become such an important part of modern society. Without schools, many people imagine that children would struggle to acquire the knowledge needed to become successful adults. But for more than 99% of human history, schools did not exist. There were no classrooms, no report cards, no homework assignments, and no organized schedules separating learning from everyday life. Yet ancient humans still managed to raise children, who became skilled hunters, knowledgeable gatherers, capable parents, and productive members of their communities. Every generation successfully passed important knowledge to the next, long before anyone built the first school. This creates a fascinating question, because survival in the ancient world required an enormous amount of practical knowledge. Children needed to learn which plants were safe to eat, where water could be found, how to recognize danger, and how to cooperate with other people. They also needed to understand animal behavior, seasonal changes, tool use, social rules, and countless other skills essential for survival. The challenge was far greater than simply memorizing information, because mistakes could have serious consequences. A child who failed to recognize a poisonous plant or misunderstood an important survival lesson might place themselves and others at risk. Despite these challenges, prehistoric communities educated children remarkably effectively for hundreds of thousands of years. The secret was that education was not separated from life. Learning happened continuously throughout the day, while children watched, listened, explored, played, and participated in community activities. Instead of attending school for a few hours, children were surrounded by learning opportunities almost every moment they were awake. Knowledge was not locked inside books, because the entire world functioned as a classroom. Parents taught lessons without calling them lessons, and children absorbed information without realizing they were being educated. For ancient humans, learning was woven directly into daily life, rather than being treated as a separate activity. And that difference may explain why prehistoric children learned far more than many people imagine. Childhood in a hunter-gatherer community looked very different from childhood in the modern world. There was no clear boundary separating time for learning from time for living, because both activities happened simultaneously. Children spent most of their days surrounded by parents, grandparents, siblings, and other members of the community. As a result, they constantly observed the activities that kept their group alive. When adults searched for food, children often watched the process unfold in real time. When tools were repaired, children observed every step from start to finish. When meals were prepared, children saw where ingredients came from and how they were transformed into food. Nothing was hidden behind classroom walls because knowledge existed openly within everyday life. A young child might spend the morning watching gatherers identify edible plants across the landscape. Later that same day, the child could observe hunters discussing animal tracks and recent movements of prey. By evening, the child might sit near a campfire listening to stories that contained practical lessons about survival. This constant exposure allowed children to absorb information gradually over many years. Learning did not occur through lectures or examinations. Instead, it emerged naturally through repeated observation and participation. Children could see how experienced adults solved problems, responded to danger, and cooperated with one another. Every activity became a lesson, because every activity contributed to survival. A child observing food gathering was learning nutrition, geography, and environmental knowledge at the same time. A child watching tool production was learning craftsmanship, patience, and problem-solving skills simultaneously. Even ordinary conversations contained valuable information about relationships, social expectations, and community responsibilities. Because learning occurred continuously, education never felt separate from daily life. Children were not waiting to become useful adults someday. They were already participating in the community according to their age and abilities. As they grew older, their responsibilities increased naturally alongside their knowledge. The process resembled an apprenticeship that lasted throughout childhood rather than a formal education system. Knowledge flowed constantly from experienced individuals to younger generations, through observation, participation, and shared experiences. This approach may seem informal from a modern perspective, but it proved remarkably effective for thousands of generations. And perhaps the most powerful educational tool available to ancient children was something they naturally loved to do every day. They played. Play was far more important in ancient childhood than most people realize. Modern adults often view play as entertainment, but for prehistoric children it served as one of the primary ways important skills were developed. Children naturally imitate the people around them, and ancient children were no different. When they watched hunters tracking animals, they often recreated those activities during games with friends. When they observed adults making tools, they experimented with miniature versions of those same tasks. Many traditional hunter-gatherer societies documented by anthropologists show children creating toy bows, small spears, miniature baskets, and other simplified tools. These objects were not merely toys, they were practice equipment. Through play, children developed coordination, balance, strength, and problem-solving abilities long before those skills became necessary for survival. A child pretending to hunt was not simply having fun. That child was rehearsing behaviors that might eventually help provide food for a family. A child climbing trees, running across uneven ground, or exploring the landscape was developing physical abilities useful throughout adulthood. Play also helped children learn social skills essential for life within a cooperative community. Games taught children how to share resources, follow rules, resolve conflicts, and work together toward common goals. These lessons were difficult to teach through direct instruction, but emerged naturally during group activities. Children learned how to negotiate, communicate, and build relationships while playing with one another. Mistakes carried relatively low consequences during play, allowing children to experiment safely while developing new abilities. This created an environment where learning felt enjoyable rather than forced. The human brain appears particularly well adapted for this type of learning. Children are naturally curious, and curiosity encourages exploration. Exploration generates experience, and experience produces knowledge. Instead of memorizing information from textbooks, ancient children often learned through direct interaction with the world around them. They discovered how objects behaved, how landscapes changed, and how people cooperated through first-hand experience. This process transformed childhood into a continuous training period disguised as play. By the time children reached adolescence, many practical skills had already been practiced for years. What appeared to be simple games were often preparing them for adult responsibilities. And unlike modern schools, education did not depend entirely on parents, because the responsibility for teaching children was shared by the entire community. Education in ancient societies was not the responsibility of two parents alone. Children grew up surrounded by a network of relatives and community members who all contributed to the learning process. Anthropologists sometimes describe this arrangement as cooperative child rearing, because many adults participated in raising the next generation. Grandparents often played especially important roles within hunter-gatherer communities. Because they possessed decades of experience, they carried valuable knowledge about food, weather patterns, social relationships, and survival strategies. Older individuals could pass this knowledge to children even after they were no longer physically capable of demanding tasks, such as hunting. Older siblings also became important teachers. Younger children frequently spent time with slightly older children who had already mastered basic skills and responsibilities. This created a natural chain of learning that extended throughout the community. Knowledge flowed not only from adults to children, but also between children of different ages. A skilled hunter might teach tracking techniques to curious adolescents. An experienced gatherer could demonstrate how to identify edible plants while explaining which species should be avoided. A talented toolmaker might allow children to watch every stage of creating a stone tool, from selecting raw materials to shaping the finished product. Each individual contributed expertise, developed through years of experience. As a result, children were exposed to a wide variety of role models, rather than relying on a single teacher. Different people specialized in different skills, and children learned from whoever possessed the most knowledge in a particular area. This diversity strengthened the educational system because information came from many sources. If one person died, important knowledge did not disappear completely. Other members of the community could continue teaching the same skills. The system also helped children discover their own strengths and interests. Some became fascinated by hunting. Others showed greater interest in plants, toolmaking, storytelling, or social leadership. Because learning occurred in many different contexts, children could explore multiple paths while gradually developing expertise. The community itself functioned as a living school where knowledge was constantly exchanged between generations. There were no classrooms, but there were countless teachers. There were no official lessons, but learning occurred every day. And perhaps the most powerful teaching tool available to these communities did not involve direct instruction at all. It involved stories. Long before books existed, stories served as one of humanity's most powerful educational tools. Every evening, families and community members often gathered around campfires, where knowledge could be shared through conversation and storytelling. To modern ears, these stories might sound like entertainment. For ancient humans, they were often lessons disguised as entertainment. A story about a hunter encountering a dangerous animal could teach children how to behave in similar situations. A story about someone becoming lost might contain valuable information about landmarks, navigation, and survival. A story about a foolish decision could communicate important social rules without requiring direct criticism. Stories were memorable because they connected information to emotions. People are far more likely to remember a dramatic narrative than a list of instructions. Ancient communities understood this principle long before psychologists began studying human memory. Important knowledge was often woven into stories that children wanted to hear repeatedly. Each retelling reinforced lessons about the environment, social behavior, and community values. Many myths and legends also contained practical information about local geography. Stories described rivers, mountains, dangerous locations, migration routes, and seasonal changes in the landscape. Children listening around a fire were gradually building mental maps of the world around them. Animal behavior was another common subject. Stories explained where certain animals could be found, how they behaved, and which dangers they presented. Even moral lessons were often delivered through narratives rather than direct commands. Children learned about honesty, cooperation, courage, and responsibility by following the experiences of characters within stories. This approach made learning engaging rather than burdensome. Knowledge became easier to remember because it was attached to vivid images, emotions, and memorable events. Oral traditions allowed communities to preserve information across many generations without writing anything down. Some stories survived for centuries because they contained knowledge people considered important enough to remember. In this way, storytelling functioned as a library, a classroom, and a cultural archive all at the same time. Every generation inherited information from previous generations and then passed it forward to the next. The remarkable part is that this system worked. For thousands of years, communities successfully preserved survival knowledge without schools, textbooks, or written records. And that raises an important question. Why was this educational system so effective for so long? The success of ancient education becomes easier to understand when we remember that its primary goal was very different from the goals of modern schools. Today, education often prepares people for a highly specialized world, filled with technology, institutions, and complex careers. Ancient communities faced a different challenge. They needed children to become competent adults capable of surviving and contributing to the group. Their educational system focused directly on that objective. Learning was practical, because it was connected to real situations children encountered every day. Knowledge gained in the morning could often be applied before the day ended. A child learning about edible plants might help gather food that same afternoon. A child practicing toolmaking could immediately see whether a technique worked or failed. Feedback was constant, because the environment itself provided answers. This direct connection between learning and experience made information easier to understand and remember. Children were not studying abstract concepts disconnected from reality. They were learning skills that clearly mattered. Motivation emerged naturally because knowledge had obvious value. The system also benefited from repetition. Children observed the same activities hundreds or even thousands of times while growing up. They watched adults gather food, repair tools, tell stories, solve problems, and cooperate with one another. Over time, these observations accumulated into deep, practical knowledge. Learning occurred gradually, rather than being compressed into formal lessons. Mistakes became opportunities to improve, rather than reasons for failure. Young people developed confidence because they practiced skills repeatedly over many years. By adulthood, many important abilities felt natural, because they had been reinforced throughout childhood. Ancient education also recognized something modern science increasingly supports. Humans learn effectively through observation, participation, storytelling, imitation, and play. These methods align closely with the way the human brain evolved. The goal was never to fill children with information. The goal was to prepare them for life. And for hundreds of thousands of years, that goal was achieved remarkably well. The next time you think about education, remember that schools represent only a tiny fraction of human history. For most of our existence, classrooms did not exist, textbooks had not been invented, and formal teachers were rare. Yet generation after generation successfully learned everything necessary to survive. They learned by watching. They learned by playing. They learned by listening. They learned by participating. Most importantly, they learned because the entire community took part in the process. For ancient humans, childhood itself was the classroom. Everyday life was the curriculum, and the world around them was the teacher. Long before the first school was ever built, humanity had already discovered how to educate the next generation.